Looking at the title of this video, you might be confused. Of course Fromsoft made Dark Souls 2. That's the one everyone hated on release, but now has decided to glaze. Sure, Fromsoft made a sequel to Dark Souls. In fact, they made two, as well as newer additions for the first two entries in the trilogy. Furthermore, they've taken inspiration from Dark Souls in essentially all of their titles since the game's release in 2011. But this isn't what I mean. Instead, what I'm trying to say is that Fromsoft has never made another game that feels quite like Dark Souls 1. Now, this might sound kind of strange. After all, Dark Souls, along with Demon Souls, laid the foundation for everything that Fromsoft as a studio has achieved since. Furthermore, this foundation has advanced the industry at large, and yeah, mechanically, the games that the studio has released since do feel quite similar. A general understanding of how these games function at a base level can be gained from playing just one of the titles. However, the beauty of games is that they're not just gameplay, nor art, nor music, nor any of the other disciplines that make them up. And while gameplay has been left fairly untouched, Fromsoft has experimented in many other facets. In the process, though, they've left behind the identity of the original Dark Souls. To reiterate, in the nearly decade and a half since the release of Dark Souls 1, Fromsoft has yet to make another game that feels quite the same. Now, before I get into my main points, I just want to preemptively clarify something. While a lot of this video might sound like I'm trying to say Fromsoft fell off, that's not my intent at all. Personally, I think Dark Souls 1 has some really unique and special things going for it, but I do not think that the game is perfect. Nor do I think, by choosing to go in different directions, that Fromsoft has dropped the ball. Honestly, my favorite title in their catalog is Dark Souls 3 for its amazing bosses and overall gameplay feel. Bloodborne has such a cool aesthetic, and Elden Ring's scope is just unbelievable. However, what I want to talk about with this video is a certain je ne sais quoi that makes Dark Souls 1 Dark Souls 1. Perhaps a good starting point for this discussion is the rather obvious change, that being Fromsoft's and the industry's technological advances since Dark Souls 1. Since that first game, there have been graphical advances, memory advances, etc. What's more, Fromsoft's development team continues to grow, allowing them to make the most of this new technology and implement aspects of it into their games. Now, this aspect of change is a little tricky to discuss because it really ends up tying into other points more than it stands on its own. So, what I want to just say briefly is that at the time Dark Souls was being developed, there were considerably more technological restrictions that the team had to work around. And this was true of games in general at the time. The result of restrictions like this, in the game space, was some of the most ingenious optimizations and strategies that have been developed in software. Going back even further, adding in even more restrictions, we begin to see even crazier techniques that nowadays just seem absolutely insane. Now, from what I've heard, the original version of Dark Souls 1 didn't run particularly well. But this doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't feature trademarks of a more restrictive technological budget. Furthermore, it's not to say that developers today don't have to think about optimization, and arguably some teams could think about it a little more. But it's not as ingrained in the overall design and development process as it once was. Anyway, let's move on and look at some more specific examples of change. First up to bat is art style. Now that I say that though, perhaps that's not the best wording for it. In general, Fromsoft's games have kept a very similar art style since Demon Souls. While the graphical fidelity has improved, they're shooting for that mostly realistic look. Perhaps, then, a better choice of wording would be art direction. Dark Souls 1 feels very gritty, very raw, very real. The textures have a general muddiness to them that doesn't add any glamour or idealism to the landscape. Again, This is in some ways more of a technology thing. Dark Souls 1 is generally lower res than any of the following games, which can lead to that muddy effect. However, this look is still present in Dark Souls 1 Remastered, which was released after Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne, and Dark Souls 3. So I have to think that it's not just the technology. Even with higher quality textures, the game holds on to this very grounded aesthetic. Furthermore, while the sort of gray look was not uncommon at the time in video games, it is aged far more gracefully in Dark Souls 1 than in some other titles. While some of those games now just look dated, Lordran was always supposed to be this decrepit, faded kingdom, and Fromsoft leveraged the texture styles beautifully to show players this. Now, trying to say that Fromsoft's work since then hasn't been gritty would be foolish. Bloodborne is arguably the studio's most raw and primal game in their catalog. That being said, their titles since have gone in more fantastical directions, a decision which has had effects on the art direction of the games. Bloodborne, again, is definitely grittier than Dark Souls 1, but being eldritch horror, it also departs farther from the reality we know than Dark Souls 1. The creatures of Yharnam are horrifying. They're gritty, they're raw, but they don't feel real or plausible in the same way that most of Lordran's denizens do. Dark Souls 3, released the next year, returned to a somewhat more grounded setting, but it also felt the closest to mainstream high fantasy of the titles in the trilogy. The game's most staggering set pieces, often its dragon fights like Ancient Wyvern, Nameless King, or Dark Eater Midir, feel much more vibrant than anything Dark Souls 1 gave us. One specific example is in how lighting is handled in these fights. Where in Dark Souls 1, the light might feel much more splotchy and unprocessed, the lightning, flames, and dark magic of Dark Souls 3's biggest moments still have stark colors that contrast the more gray backgrounds. Elden Ring is, in many ways, an extension of Dark Souls 3 in this way. Like with that game, Elden Ring contains very vibrant effects and environs, something that was likely, at least in part, a product of its drawing some inspiration from things like mythology and folklore. Jumping back a bit in time, Dark Souls 2 feels the most like its predecessor from an art style, or rather art direction, standpoint. But even it feels decidedly different from early on. Majula is a beautiful, comforting hub, and that's in large part because of the soothing sunlight that bathes the settlement. Dark Souls 1 has sunlight too, but it never feels warm. It simply serves to reveal how cold and inhospitable the world around you really is. In a somewhat similar vein to art direction, another thing that Fromsoft has not approached in quite the same way since Dark Souls 1 is just general vibes. Perhaps the best way I can summarize this is that Dark Souls 1 feels the closest to horror, except for Bloodborne, in this set of games. On the point of Bloodborne though, the horror that game cultivates is not the same as what Dark Souls 1 opts for. Bloodborne is a very in-your-face horror, while Dark Souls 1's horror is quieter, more subtle, but still lurking around every corner of Lordran. Lordran as a setting is a tense, foreboding place. This is not something unique in the Fromsoft catalog by any means, but its execution here is. Other worlds that Fromsoft has made since are harsh, cruel, and openly opposed to the player's progress. This doesn't feel true in the same way with Lordran though. Rather than being the bully, this place is a bystander, totally uncaring to the pain and misfortune that the player will go through. There's no malice in its attitude towards you. It simply feels nothing at all, and this is perhaps scarier than a world that openly rejects you. That would at least be upfront, but this is unknown. Due to this, Dark Souls 1 feels far lonelier than any game since. While all of the following games also essentially focus on one lone warrior, you never feel as starved for company as you do in Dark Souls 1. This is due to a lot of things, generally less enemies, less music, those muddy landscapes, etc. But the result of all this is that you rarely feel welcome in the space. Later titles may, for instance, have more enemies trying to kill you, but at least it's some form of interaction with other beings. Lore drain is quite uncaring, but, to clarify, this doesn't mean that it doesn't create opportunities for its denizens to hurt each other. The best example of this, in terms of vibes, is the tight layout of Lore drain. As Fromsoft has progressed, their games have generally become more and more open, with Elden Ring and its spin-off Night Rain fully embracing open world and open zone designs. Dark Souls 1, however, is borderline claustrophobic. You might not notice this too much in the moment, but so often in Dark Souls 1, the camera is pressed uncomfortably close to the player, just so that it's not inside the surrounding geometry, something you don't see as much in the studio's work since. Amidst the maze of twists and turns, all manner of foes can lurk, waiting for the player, jumping at them from all directions to punish them for being so careless. What's more, this often makes it much harder for the player to simply skirt around danger. Even if they make it past one set of enemies, they may easily get trapped by the next, and then sandwiched in a horde that they have no hopes of overcoming. These tight spaces are an interesting example of how technology drives the choices game developers make. Again, games had a smaller resource budget when Dark Souls was first released, making it advantageous to limit the amount of objects that would have to be rendered per frame. By creating a tighter map, developers can still achieve high levels of detail and create intricate maps without sacrificing too much system load, because you may only need to render one small corridor at a time. Lore drain is, perhaps, one of Fromsoft's most natural worlds because of its impartiality. Other worlds might feel more game-like, but in Dark Souls 1, it really just feels as though this is an actual place which creatures have made their home, and adapted to suit their needs. Up to this point, I've talked a lot about how Dark Souls 1 feels different from later games, but now let's look a bit more at what might be driving that change. Perhaps one of the biggest drivers of this is the fact that now, it feels as though gameplay has taken more of a center stage in FromSoft's titles. Where there was more space for just vibes before, the studio now has more pressure on them to deliver on the quintessential experience of play that they're known for. If you spent time around games on the internet, you've probably come across the phenomenon of, "This is the Souls-like of blank." This phrase has been used in everything from "this is the Souls-like of cooking games" to "this is the Souls-like of idle clickers." Probably, I haven't fact-checked that, but you know what I'm talking about. The thing is that FromSoft's games have gained such a reputation for their difficulty that, especially outside of their community, that has become the main component of their games' identities, putting pressure on them to continue to deliver in this way. This is further encouraged by the fact that players are getting better. What would challenge a player in 2011 might well be trivial for a player in 2025. All of this has meant that FromSoft's games have leaned more into the difficulty over time, even if they're not always strictly more difficult. The emphasis on delivering this difficulty in gameplay unfortunately means that there might not always be the same space for other aspects. Building on this is the fact that the popularity of the genre has skyrocketed. These titles have gone from cult classics to somewhat mainstream games. Elden Ring especially really catapulted FromSoft's games into the broader gaming space. With this extra attention, there is now more pressure than ever on FromSoft to deliver, and this is another place where the change in vibes comes in. Dark Souls 1, and even more so Demon's Souls, were highly experimental, and since then, FromSoft has often aimed to perfect these concepts rather than to continue in wildly new directions quite as much. This may sound like I'm bashing FromSoft and saying they're playing it safe, but that's not the point I'm trying to make. I do think that their games have gone in a more mainstream direction since Dark Souls 1, but like I said earlier, Dark Souls 1 isn't even my favorite game of their catalog. This approach to game development since Dark Souls 1 has created some truly incredible titles. But perhaps the biggest reason that nothing has felt like Dark Souls 1 is that FromSoft is brave enough to experiment. Yes, I just said they're not going in crazy new directions, but that doesn't mean their design has stagnated. Simply put, FromSoft loves to try new things. Look no further than Night Rain and the Dustbloods. Night Rain is a blast, and I got more lasting fun out of it than I ever expected to. and I'm hyped to see more about the Duskbloods, even though I'm not planning on playing it unless it comes to PC someday. Ultimately, a likely reason that we haven't seen anything quite like Dark Souls 1 is because Fromsoft explored that, and then saw interest in other directions and decided to go there. So, to wrap things up, Fromsoft is a studio that continues to innovate in their approach to game design and development. Each game they develop has its own unique feel and character. To me, there's always been something about Dark Souls 1 that stands apart from their other creations in the gaming norm, even more so than their other titles. In all honesty, I really did not like the game on my first playthrough, at least from Sen's Fortress onward. That being said, I couldn't get the game out of my head, even after slogging my way through the second half. Those first couple hours in particular, with no idea what to expect, dropped into the stunning and bizarre world of Lordran. I haven't had a gameplay experience like that before or since. The game truly was a product of its time, and, in reality, a game like it couldn't be made today. The culmination of the technology, the gaming culture at the time, and the lack of any games like it, all of this together creates the experience of Dark Souls. If you enjoyed this, yay, I'm glad, thanks for watching. If you're interested in games, game development, and the Souls-like genre, I've got some stuff coming up that you might be interested in. If not, thanks for sticking with me on this topic you seemingly have no interest in. Cheers! Anyway, hope to see you around, and thanks for watching.